Rain didn't just fall that night, it demanded a choice. One man pulled over when everyone else kept driving, and from that single pause a story was born that neither mercy nor time could erase. What came after wasn't coincidence. It was the kind of twist life saves for those who've already lost everything once. Watch to the end, hit like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. The storm was merciless that night, drenching the streets of Akron, Ohio, until even the stoplights blurred into smears of red and gold through the rain. Dorian Hale, a black single father in his 30s, tightened his grip on the steering wheel of his old Ford truck. The windshield wipers screeched across the glass, struggling to keep pace with the downpour. After 14 hours on a construction site, his hands ached and his eyes burned from exhaustion. But it wasn't the kind of tired that sleep could fix. It was the kind that came from years of holding things together alone. His son Micah was at home with the sitter, probably asleep with his comic books scattered across the couch. Dorian should have been there already, but the road back from the site was long, and the storm had turned every mile into a fight. He told himself that nothing good came from stopping for strangers. Not at this hour. Not in this weather. But then his headlights swept past the bus shelter. That was when he saw her. A woman hunched over, soaked to the bone, clutching a baby wrapped in a thin pink blanket. She looked like she was shrinking under the weight of the storm itself. Dorian's instinct screamed to keep driving to get home to stay safe. But something deep inside him twisted a voice he hadn't heard since his wife died, whispering, "Don't leave them there." He pressed the brake, and the tires skidded water spraying out like white wings. The truck came to a shuddering stop. For a long moment he just sat there, heart thudding, trying to convince himself to move on. He'd learned the hard way that helping people often came with consequences. But when lightning flashed again, he saw the woman's face clearly young, no older than 30 eyes, red from crying lips trembling as she tried to hush the baby. Dorian cursed under his breath, grabbed his jacket and stepped out into the cold. Rain slapped his face as he jogged toward the shelter. "Hey," he called over the thunder. The woman looked up, startled, clutching the baby tighter. "Ma'am, you can't stay out here. It's freezing." She shook her head, backing up a step. "We're fine," she said, though her voice cracked. Her scrubs clung to her like a second skin her shoes soaked through. "Please," he said softer now. "You and that baby, she needs warmth. We'll wait for the bus." Dorian looked around. The street was empty, buses long stopped running hours ago. "There's no bus coming." She blinked rapidly, eyes filling again. "I don't have anywhere to go." The words hit him harder than the rain. He'd said almost those exact words once to his sister, to his pastor, to no one at all after the funeral, when his bank account had bled dry and his son had cried for a mother who wasn't coming home. "Come on," Dorian said quietly. "My truck's warm. I can take you somewhere." "I don't know you," she said weakly. "And you don't know me," he replied. "But I'm not leaving you out here." She hesitated, then looked down at the shivering baby. The tiny girl's cough was enough to break her resolve. She nodded. Dorian guided them toward the truck, shielding them with his jacket as best he could. "What's your name?" he asked as he opened the passenger door. "Renee," she murmured. "Renee Latham, and this is Junia." Dorian helped her climb in, then closed the door gently. When he got behind the wheel, the cab filled with the smell of wet clothes and something faintly sterile, like the scent of a hospital. "You a nurse?" he asked. She nodded, rocking the baby slowly. "Used to be." He didn't press further. He turned the heater up and started driving. Rain drummed on the roof like 1,000 ticking clocks. Every few seconds, Dorian glanced over. Renee was staring straight ahead, her face pale, jaw set. He recognized that look, the one people wore when they'd run out of plans. The one that meant they were just trying to get through the night. "You got family around here?" he asked finally. She shook her head. "No one. Just us." "What about friends? None I can call." Her voice was barely audible over the rain. He nodded slowly, jaw tightening. He didn't know what story lay behind that, but it didn't matter tonight. When they reached his street, a narrow row of old duplexes with peeling paint, he parked under the streetlight. "You can stay here tonight," he said, "just until you figure something out." "I don't want to intrude," she said quickly. "You're not." he replied. It's just me and my boy. She looked at him for a long second, then down at the sleeping child in her arms. Okay, she whispered. Dorian led them up the steps, unlocking the door with stiff fingers. Inside the apartment smelled faintly of coffee and sawdust. The heater rattled to life. You can set her on the couch, he said. I'll get some towels. Renee hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing into his home meant something she couldn't undo. But then Junia coughed again, and she stepped forward. Dorian handed her a towel and pointed to the bathroom. Down the hall. Take your time. When the door clicked shut, he exhaled and leaned against the wall. He didn't know what he'd just invited into his life, but somehow it didn't feel wrong. A few minutes later, he peeked into Micah's room. She looked around with the eyes of someone who didn't believe safety could exist. You can put her down, Dorian said gently, gesturing to the couch. I'll grab some towels. He disappeared down the hall and returned with 2 faded ones, a flannel shirt and a small blanket from Micah's closet. When he handed them over, she hesitated before taking them, as though the simple act of being helped was a foreign language she no longer knew how to speak. Bathroom's down there, he said, nodding towards the hall. You can dry off, change your clothes. Thank you, she murmured. Her voice was soft, unsteady like every word cost her strength. When she emerged 10 minutes later, she looked less like a ghost, and more like a woman who'd been through a war. Her dark hair hung loose, damp, but no longer dripping, and the borrowed flannel dwarfed her frame. The baby wrapped in a clean towel was finally asleep. She's out, Dorian said, smiling slightly. Guess the storm tired her out. Renee nodded and sat carefully on the edge of the couch. I don't know how to thank you, she said. You already did, he replied, pouring her tea. You trusted me. She looked up sharply, eyes searching his face for something she couldn't name. Most people don't stop, she said quietly. Most people pretend they don't see. Yeah, Dorian said, sitting across from her. I've been both people. The kettle hissed softly in the background as they sat in the faint glow of the lamp. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Dorian asked, So, what happened? Renee traced her finger around the rim of the cup, eyes downcast. You really want to know? Only if you want to tell it, he said. Sometimes talking helps. She exhaled, long and shaky. I used to be a nurse at Akron General. Been there 5 years. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. Then last month they cut staff. Said restructuring. 15 of us gone overnight. No notice, no severance. She gave a small, bitter laugh. I thought I could handle it. I started looking for work right away, but once word spreads that you were laid off, no one wants to touch you. Everyone assumes you did something wrong. She stopped staring at her tea, as if the steam might fill the silence for her. My landlord didn't care that I lost my job. Rent was due yesterday. I begged for another week, but he gave me an hour to pack up and go. Dorian frowned. You walked here? She nodded, eyes glassy. 10 miles. I tried the shelters full. Every single one. I spent last night in a bus station feeding Junia the last jar of baby food I had. I haven't eaten in 2 days. Just tried to keep her fed. She looked up, her lips trembling. You ever get so tired you forget what pride feels like? Dorian swallowed hard. He didn't need to imagine it. He'd lived it the nights he'd skipped dinner so Micah could eat the mornings he'd hidden tears behind a coffee mug. Yeah, he said finally. I know that kind of tired. He rose without a word, went to the kitchen, and returned with a plate leftover rice and chicken he'd made earlier. Eat, he said simply. Renee blinked as though unsure he was serious. Go ahead, he added. You're no good to her if you starve. She hesitated, then took the fork, her hand trembling. She ate slowly at first, like she needed permission for each bite, then faster, as hunger overtook hesitation. Dorian sat quietly, pretending to scroll through his phone so she wouldn't feel watched. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, ashamed. I'm sorry, she murmured. Don't be, he said. It's just food. You don't even know me, she said suddenly. Why are you doing this? Dorian leaned back in the chair, staring at the window where raindrops chased one another down the glass. Because someone should have done it for me when I needed it. She said nothing, but her expression softened the tension in her shoulders, easing for the first time. You got family you can call, he asked. No, she said flatly. Parents gone, no siblings. Junia's father left before she was born. Guess he wasn't ready to be a dad. And friends not anymore. Turns out people disappear when you start needing things. Dorian nodded slowly. Yeah, I remember that part too. The words hung between them, heavy but honest. He rose again and motioned toward the small office down the hall. You can take that room tonight. It's not much old futon space heater, but it beats the rain. You've done enough, she said weakly. Please, I can stay on the couch. Nah, he said. The couch is lumpy and Micah will be up at dawn looking for cartoons. The office is quieter. She looked at him for a long moment, eyes searching for deceit, finding none. Renee was already awake, sitting at the small table with Junia asleep in her arms. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but there was a calmness there now, a fragile kind of peace. You're up early, Dorian said quietly, not wanting to startle her. Habit, she murmured. At the hospital, morning started before the sun. He nodded, pouring himself coffee, then hesitated before offering, Want some? She shook her head. I don't drink coffee. Tea's enough. Suit yourself, he said, sitting opposite her. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence between two people who'd both forgotten what company felt like. Did you sleep okay? He asked. Better than I have in weeks, she admitted, her voice almost apologetic, like rest was something she didn't deserve. That futon isn't exactly luxury, he said with a small smile. After the sidewalk, it's a dream, she replied. And for the first time, he saw a flicker of humor in her eyes. The baby stirred, and Renee adjusted her carefully. Dorian watched the motion, how instinctively protective she was, how that small girl seemed to anchor her in place. You said you used to be a nurse, he said after a while. Yeah, she replied softly. It feels like another lifetime now. What made you choose it? She looked down, tracing circles on Junia's blanket. I wanted to help people. My mom was sick most of my teenage years, heart problems. The nurses at the ward were the ones who kept her alive longer than anyone thought possible. They treated her like family. I wanted to be that for someone else. You were, Dorian said quietly, until the system decided you weren't profitable anymore. Renee's lips tightened into a line. That's about right. She took a breath. When I lost the job, I thought I could manage. I had savings plans, all those things you think protect you. But when Junia's father left, it got harder. Dorian's head lifted slightly. He left Renee, knotted eyes distant. The day I told him I was pregnant, he said he wasn't ready, that I'd ruined his life. Funny thing, he was the one who wanted a family first. I spent months trying to convince myself he'd come back, that he'd walk through the door and realize what he threw away. He never did. I stopped waiting when Junia was born. The words hung heavy between them, and Dorian felt something stir deep in his chest. The quiet strength in her voice reminded him of someone he'd lost long ago. I'm sorry, he said softly. You didn't deserve that. Neither did she, Renee whispered, brushing a hand over Junia's tiny curls. Dorian looked away, swallowing hard. The conversation had cracked something open in both of them, and though the room was still, their memories filled the space like ghosts that had finally found company. My wife Dorian began slowly. Her name was Lorna. She was a nurse, too, worked at Akron General. Renee's head snapped up, eyes wide. Akron General? Yeah, you know it. Renee stopped, her throat tightening. That's where I worked. I started there 6 years ago. When did she pass? 4 years back? He said, his voice low but steady. Ovarian cancer. Stage 4 by the time they caught it. Renee's expression softened, grief and recognition passing across her face like a shadow. I think I remember her name, she said softly. Lorna Hale? She was kind. Everyone loved her. Dorian froze his coffee mug halfway to his lips. You knew her? Not personally, Renee said quickly, shaking her head. I was still new at the time, but I remember the staff talking about her, how she kept working shifts, even during treatment, how she always smiled. The words hit him like a wave, memories rising unbidden. He could see Lorna sitting on the edge of their bed, pale and tired, but still trying to smile for Micah, still making jokes about hospital food. She did, he murmured half to himself. She smiled through everything. Renee looked down again, guilt flickering in her eyes. I'm sorry, she said. I didn't mean to. No, Dorian interrupted, shaking his head. It's good to hear someone remember her. Sometimes it feels like I'm the only one who still does. A silence followed, thick, but not empty. It was full of things neither knew how to say. Renee shifted in her seat, then spoke softly. You must have loved her a lot. I did, Dorian said. Still do. She was my anchor. When she died, He stopped, struggling for words. I didn't know who I was without her. And now, Renee asked gently. Now, he said after a long pause, I'm trying to remember what living feels like. The clock on the wall ticked quietly as the rain drizzled against the windows. In the distance, a car passed on the wet road. Renee's eyes lingered on him, studying the lines in his face, the quiet sadness behind his calm. She recognized it because it was the same kind she saw in the mirror. You're doing better than you think, she said softly. You didn't have to stop for us. But you did. Dorian gave a small, tired smile. Maybe because I know what it's like to be standing in the rain waiting for something that isn't coming. Her lips curved faintly, bittersweet. Then maybe we both stopped running last night. Dorian looked at her, then at Junia, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm outside, or the two people rebuilding pieces of themselves over cooling cups of tea. For the first time in a long time, the world didn't feel quite so heavy. When Renee stood to lay Junia in the office, Dorian found himself watching her with quiet respect. The sound of small feet pattering against the hall floor reminded him that the world outside his grief still moved forward. His 7-year-old son, Micah, appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes, his pajamas wrinkled and hair sticking out like a startled bird's nest. Dad, why is there a baby in the living room? He asked in that blunt, sleepy tone only children could manage. Dorian blinked, caught between the weight of yesterday and the light of the new day. He set the mug down and motioned for Micah to keep his voice down. They're guests, he said softly. A lady and her daughter needed a place to stay last night. Micah tilted his head. Are they gonna live here now? Dorian chuckled under his breath. I don't know about that, buddy. They just needed somewhere warm. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure if he wanted it to be temporary. Renee appeared moments later from the hallway, wearing his oversized flannel shirt, her hair tied up loosely. She looked both nervous and apologetic. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude, she began, but Dorian waved off the apology. You're fine. This is Micah, he said, gesturing to the boy. Micah, this is Miss Renee and her little girl, Junia. The baby was still asleep in her arms, her tiny hands clutching at the edge of the towel. Hey, Micah said shyly, and then with childlike curiosity, she's small. Renee smiled faintly. Yeah, she's still learning how to take up space. That made Dorian laugh quietly. You hungry? He asked her. I can make something simple. Pancakes and eggs. You don't have to. I'm already up, he said. And Micah never says no to pancakes. It's true, Micah added, seriously climbing into a chair. The kitchen filled with the sound of whisking, the sizzle of batter meeting the hot pan, and for a little while, the world outside ceased to exist. Renee set Junia down on the couch with a blanket and watched as Micah tried to help Dorian cook, spilling flour across the counter in the process. When Dorian caught her watching, she looked away quickly. Sorry, she said, it's just, I haven't heard laughter in so long. Not in a home. Dorian paused, spatula in hand. Neither have I, he admitted quietly. Breakfast turned into something more than a meal. It was the first shared ritual of a house learning how to breathe again. When Junia woke, blinking her bright eyes and reaching out with tiny fingers, Micah immediately ran over. She can have my toy truck, he declared proudly, handing it to her with both hands. Renee started to protest, but Dorian stopped her with a gentle shake of his head. Let him, he said. He's got plenty. Junia giggled, banging the truck against the table leg, and Micah laughed too, the sound high and genuine. Renee stared at them as if she'd forgotten what joy looked like. After they ate, Dorian walked her to the door to throw out the trash. You really don't have to stay long, he said, almost out of reflex. You've got things to figure out, and I know, she interrupted softly. And I will. I just need a few days to get my bearings. I'll find something. I don't doubt that, he said, studying her tired face. But you don't have to rush. You and the little one can stay as long as you need." She hesitated, clearly torn between gratitude and pride. "You've already done more than anyone else has." "I didn't do anything special," he said. "I just stopped." "Most people don't," she replied, and her voice trembled at the truth of it. They stood there for a second too long, the space between them filled with something that wasn't quite silence, wasn't quite comfort, but some fragile mix of both. From behind them came Micah's voice. "Dad, she said she likes pancakes better than cereal." Dorian turned laughing despite himself. "Good taste," he called back. Renee smiled, an unguarded, weary smile that didn't quite reach her eyes but tried its best. The rest of the morning moved easily, the rhythm of routine returnings, but softer, somehow less mechanical. Dorian noticed the way Micah followed Renee around, curious but polite, asking endless questions about her work. "So you help sick people?" he asked her. "Used to," she said. "Maybe again someday." "That's cool," he said, nodding thoughtfully. "My mom was sick before she went to heaven. Maybe you could have helped her." The words hung in the air like a blade made of air and memory. Renee froze, caught off guard, her throat tightening as she searched for a response. Dorian stood still too, his hand tightening on the countertop. "Micah," he said softly, "why don't you go check if Junia's awake?" The boy nodded and ran off, leaving behind a silence that seemed to hum. "I'm sorry," Renee whispered. "He didn't mean I know," Dorian said, his voice rougher than before. "It's fine." But it wasn't, not really. It opened a wound he'd managed to live around but never truly heal. He exhaled slowly and turned toward her. "He talks about her sometimes. Not a lot, just in passing. I think it helps him remember the good things." "That's important," she said softly. "He's a good kid." "Yeah," he murmured. "He's got her heart." The light outside brightened just enough to cast pale gold across the floor, and Renee looked at Dorian with quiet understanding. "She must have been someone special," she said. "She was," he answered simply. "She still is." Later that day, after Micah had gone to a friend's house and Junia was napping again, Dorian found himself standing in the living room doorway, watching Renee fold a blanket she hadn't been asked to touch. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she replied, smiling faintly. "But it feels good to do something useful." Mornings began with the sound of Micah's laughter echoing through the kitchen, followed by Junia's babbling, Renee's soft voice coaxing her to eat, and Dorian's steady footsteps as he prepared to head out to work. What had once been a house built on silence now held the gentle hum of life. He didn't speak about it, but every night when he came home from the construction site and saw the lights on through the window, he felt something shift quietly inside him, something long dormant. It was strange, he thought, how quickly strangers could begin to feel like family. Renee had settled into a routine, caring for the kids during the day, keeping the place tidy, cooking dinner, and still finding time to look for work. She refused to be idle. Dorian noticed her determination the way she sat at the small table by the window, with her phone pressed to her ear, voice calm and polite as she spoke to employers who mostly turned her down. Yet she kept trying. He admired that. It reminded him of Lorna, his late wife, who had fought her illness with the same quiet defiance against despair. On Thursday evening, he came home to find Renee pacing the kitchen, a rare spark in her eyes. "I got a call," she said before he could even take his jacket off. "A clinic outside town, they're looking for a part-time nurse. It's small, but it's something." Dorian's face broke into a grin. "That's great," he said. "Really great, Renee." She smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes fully. "It's just an interview, but they sounded interested. They said they liked that I had hospital experience. When is it, Monday morning?" "You'll crush it," he said without hesitation. "I'll take care of the kids if you need help." Her expression softened. "You'd do that?" "Of course," he said. "You've done plenty already." Renee looked down, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, her voice quiet. "I haven't done much, Dorian. You've done everything." "That's not true," he said firmly. "You brought this house back to life." She looked up at him, their eyes locking for just a second too long before she looked away. "I should start dinner," she murmured, breaking the moment. That night, the house smelled of roasted chicken and herbs. The kids sat at the table making a mess with crayons, drawing crooked rainbows, and stick figures that looked vaguely like the four of them. Dorian watched Renee moving easily around his kitchen, like she'd always belonged there, and felt a pang of something he couldn't name. When dinner was done and the kids were asleep, he stood by the window while Renee washed dishes. "You nervous about the interview?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. "I haven't been in a clinical setting in months. I'm scared I've forgotten how to be useful." "You haven't," he said, leaning against the counter. "I've seen you fix everything that's broken in this house: leaky faucet, burned out light, even that toaster Micah nearly destroyed. You figure things out. You always do." She smiled faintly at that. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," he said, "but you make it look like it is." Renee's hand slowed in the sink, her fingers resting against the rim of a plate. "You really think I can do this? I know you can." Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "You shouldn't say things like that," she whispered. "Why not?" "Because I'll believe you." Dorian didn't reply, and for a moment the air felt heavier, filled with words neither dared to say. When she turned back towards the sink, he quietly left the room, the echo of her voice still circling in his mind. The weekend came fast. Saturday morning found them at the park, the kids running through puddles left by the last of the rain. Dorian watched Renee laugh as Junia tried to chase Micah, her tiny boots sloshing through mud. He hadn't heard that sound, real laughter, full and unguarded in years. It did something to him. It made him ache in a way that wasn't painful, but alive. When the kids grew tired, they sat on a bench near the playground. The sunlight broke through thin clouds, painting her face in soft gold. "You okay?" she asked, noticing his gaze. "Yeah," he said quickly, then smiled awkwardly. It's been a while since I've seen a morning like this. It's been a while since I've had one," she said softly. They sat in silence, watching the children. Then, after a moment, she said, "I'll probably have to move closer to the clinic if I get the job. It's nearly 40 minutes from here." The words landed heavier than he expected. "Move," he repeated, pretending to sound casual. "Yeah, it wouldn't be right to stay here rent-free forever. You've done too much already. You don't owe me anything," he said, his tone quieter now. "That's not what I mean," she said gently. "You've been kind. I need to start standing on my own again." He nodded, though his chest tightened with every word. He should have been happy for her progress, her strength, but all he could feel was an ache growing where the quiet used to be. Later that evening, after the kids went to bed, he sat alone at the kitchen table, turning the thought over in his head. He realized with uncomfortable clarity that the idea of that house without her laughter, without the warmth she brought, felt unbearable. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. She was supposed to stay until she got on her feet, then leave. But somewhere in between, without meaning to, she'd become part of the place, part of him. The thought scared him, but it also woke something that had been buried for years. On Sunday night, Renee came to sit across from him at the table. Her hands folded, a nervous smile on her lips. "I wanted to say thank you," she said, "for everything." "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "I mean it," she said. "When I showed up that night, I didn't think anyone would ever care again." She smiled weakly. "You think so? I know." "So," he said, "you've got more fight in you than most people I've met." When he left for work, she stood in the doorway, the baby on her hip waving faintly. For the rest of the day, his mind kept drifting back to her. He tried focusing on the construction site, but the image of her hopeful eyes refused to leave. By the time he returned home, the kids were playing in the living room, and Renee was setting the table with a calm smile. "Well," he asked, setting down his tool bag. "How'd it go? I start next Monday," she said simply. "They called me an hour after the interview." Dorian grinned, something loosening inside him. "That's incredible. It's just part-time," she said. "But it's something real. That's all it takes to start again," he said. She laughed, the sound light, almost disbelieving. "You sound like someone who's done this before." "I'm still trying," he admitted, and the words hung between them like a truth neither needed to explain. The following week brought new patterns. Renee left early, dropping Junia off at the small daycare near the clinic before heading to work. Dorian handled Micah's school runs and dinners. The quiet of the house returned during the day, but it wasn't the old silence anymore. It was softer, fuller, alive with the residue of laughter. Every evening, Renee returned with stories about her patients, about the clinic's odd routines, about the kindness of the doctor who'd taken a chance on her. Dorian would listen while fixing the kids' plates, nodding, smiling, feeling an unfamiliar warmth in the ordinary. It was in those moments that he realized how much had changed, not in grand ways, but in small human ones. The house didn't feel like a shelter anymore. It felt like a home. One Thursday evening, while he was putting away groceries, he noticed a new picture frame sitting quietly on the bookshelf. Inside was a photograph he hadn't seen in years, a picture of Lorna, his late wife, smiling in her hospital scrubs. The photo had been buried in a drawer since the day of her funeral. He froze the air, suddenly too thick. Renee stepped into the room holding a towel from the laundry. "I found that in the hall closet," she said softly. "I hope it's okay. It just felt wrong her not being here." He turned toward her, the ache in his chest mixing with gratitude he couldn't put into words. "You didn't have to. I know," she said, setting the towel down, "but she's part of this house. I figured she should be seen." Dorian stared at the photo again. For years, it had been easier to pretend she wasn't watching, easier to numb himself with work and exhaustion. But now, seeing her there beside the new drawings Micah had made, beside the soft clutter of family life that had returned, he realized it didn't hurt the same way. It felt like acknowledgement instead of loss. "Thank you," he said quietly. Renee gave a small nod, her eyes glistening but steady. She had kind eyes, she murmured. "I can see where Micah gets his smile." The conversation faded into comfortable quiet, but the gesture stayed with him long after she went to bed. That night, as he sat on the porch with his coffee, he thought about how the house had changed. The wind moved through the trees with a sound that reminded him of breathing. He'd lived for years in a place that held only echoes. Now every corner held signs of life. Junia's stuffed animals scattered near the couch, Micah's shoes by the door, Renee's tea mug left half full by the sink. He realized he no longer flinched at laughter or the sound of footsteps that weren't his. He had built walls to survive, but she had filled them with warmth without asking permission. The next morning, when Renee left for her first official day, she paused at the doorway. "You'll pick up Micah?" she asked. "Got it," Dorian said, grabbing his lunchbox. "You nervous a little," she admitted. "Mostly excited. You should be." "Dorian," she said, her tone suddenly more serious. "I don't know what happens next, but thank you for giving me space to start over." "You gave it to yourself," he said. "I just opened a door." Her smile lingered as she stepped outside. After she left, Dorian stood by the window watching her cross the street, her dark hair catching the light, Junia's small hand gripping hers. He didn't know when the feeling had begun, but he knew now that he wanted them there. Not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because their presence made him remember what being alive felt like. Days turned into weeks, and as autumn slipped toward winter, the rhythm of their lives deepened. They shared dinners, laughter, small frustrations. Micah taught Junia how to stack blocks while Renee replaced the old curtains with ones she found at a thrift store. It wasn't just that the house looked better, it felt inhabited by something honest. One night when the first frost glazed the windows, Renee brought home a small potted plant and placed it by the kitchen window. Renee had been working at the clinic for several months, balancing her shifts with motherhood exhaustion and the small joys that came from routine. Dorian noticed how she hummed now when she cooked, how her laughter came easier, how her eyes no longer carried the constant edge of worry. In turn, she noticed him too, how he smiled more, how he spoke softer to Micah, how he'd begun to leave the porch light on until she returned home. They didn't speak about it, but the quiet understanding between them deepened with each passing day. By the time Junia's 8th birthday arrived, the small backyard had been transformed with balloons and a crooked paper banner Micah had helped make. The children ran circles through the grass while Dorian stood at the grill flipping burgers and trying not to burn them. Renee was beside him arranging cupcakes on a tray, her sleeves rolled up, her smile brighter than he'd ever seen. "You've got frosting on your cheeks," he teased. She wiped her face with her sleeve, leaving a bigger smudge. He laughed, reaching out with a napkin to wipe it himself. For a moment their hands brushed, and neither pulled away. The warmth between them hung there unspoken, but undeniable. When the kids screamed for cake, they stepped apart, pretending nothing had happened, though their eyes betrayed them both. Later that afternoon, after the last guest had left and the backyard had gone quiet again, Dorian found Renee standing by the fence, watching the sun sink low over the rooftops. "You threw her a good party," he said, joining her. "She'll remember this one." "She will," Renee said softly. "She's never had one before." Dorian's smile faded. "Never. When you're moving from place to place," she said, "celebrations don't really fit in. There's always something more urgent, money rent food. Today felt like a new chapter." He nodded, the ache of understanding in his chest. "You gave her that," she said, suddenly turning toward him. "You gave both of us more than you know." "I didn't do anything special," he said. "You opened a door," she replied. "That's more than most people ever do." Silence settled between them, heavy but gentle. The sound of the children laughing inside floated through the open window. Then quietly, she said, "Dorian, can I ask you something?" "Of course." She hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her sleeve. "Do you ever feel like you've been standing still too long? Like life moved on, but you stayed in the same spot?" He looked at her, really looked, and saw not the weary stranger from that night in the rain, but a woman who had rebuilt herself piece by piece. Every day, he said, until recently. Recently, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Since when? Since you," he said simply. The air stilled between them. Renee's eyes glistened as she looked down, her breath catching. "I don't want to be just friends anymore," she said, the words tumbling out like a truth she'd been holding for months. For a heartbeat, Dorian forgot how to breathe. Then he laughed, softly shaking his head. "You have no idea how long I've waited to hear that." She looked up sharply. "You have a year," he said, smiling faintly. "But I didn't want to push. You had your own road to walk." Renee's lips parted, but no words came out. Instead, she stepped closer, the space between them shrinking until he could feel her warmth. The sound of crickets rose around them, and the fading light cast a golden hue over the yard. "I was scared," she admitted. "Scared I'd ruin everything. Scared of losing what we built." "You won't," he said. "You couldn't." He reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. For a long, quiet moment, they just stood there, the world narrowing to the small patch of earth between them. Then, without another word, she leaned forward, and he met her halfway. The kiss was gentle, uncertain, full of everything they had never said aloud. It wasn't about passion. It was about recognition, two people who had both been broken now, finding pieces of themselves reflected in each other. When they finally pulled apart, Renee laughed softly, wiping at her eyes. "We're really doing this, huh?" "Looks like it," he said. "What do we tell the kids? Nothing yet?" she said, quickly shaking her head. "Let's just see where it goes." "Slow," he agreed. "I can do slow." They went back inside, pretending the world hadn't shifted, but everything about the way they moved together had changed. She brushed against him when she passed, her smile softer, her eyes brighter. He found himself glancing toward her whenever she laughed, memorizing the sound. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat side by side on the porch, the night air cool around them. "You think this is right?" she asked. "I think it's the first thing that's felt right in a long time," he said. "And if it goes wrong, then we'll fix it," he replied, "like everything else." She laughed quietly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd get to start over," she said. The days following their quiet confession unfolded like a sunrise, slow, warm, and cautious. Dorian and Renee had agreed to take things slowly, to let the new rhythm of their relationship form naturally. But love, no matter how gently held, always finds ways to test what it touches. The first test came when the cold season returned. It began as nothing more than a cough, A scratch in Renee's throat she ignored, between long shifts at the clinic. It's just the air, she told Dorian when he frowned at the sound of it. I'll be fine. But within days, her voice was gone, her body heavy with fever. The woman who had rebuilt her life with sheer strength could barely stand. Dorian found her slumped at the kitchen table one evening, her tea untouched, her face pale. Panic rose in his chest, sharp and familiar. He had seen that look before, the weakness, the trembling hands, and his mind went to the hospital room years ago, to Lorna lying beneath white sheets, promising she'd be okay even when she wasn't. He rushed to her side, steadying her before she could fall. Renee, he said softly, but urgently. You need to rest. I can't, she whispered. I have to go in tomorrow. They're short-staffed. You're sick, he said more forcefully now. You're not going anywhere. She tried to argue, but her voice cracked into a cough. Without another word, Dorian lifted her carefully, guiding her toward her room. She didn't resist. Her skin was warm beneath his hands, too warm. After tucking her into bed, he stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. The sound should have comforted him, but all he could hear was the echo of another woman's last breaths. That night he barely slept. He checked on her every hour, bringing water, cold cloths, anything to occupy his hands, and silence the fear gnawing at his chest. When morning came, Micah and Junia peeked into the room, eyes wide. Is she gonna be okay? Micah asked, his voice small. She will, Dorian said, forcing confidence he didn't feel. She just needs rest. For 2 days, the house felt heavier. The laughter that usually filled it was replaced with whispers and worry. Dorian tried to go to work, but he found himself returning early, unable to focus. Each time he saw Renee sleeping, he felt that familiar dread, the helplessness that had haunted him since Lorna's final night. On the third evening, she woke while he was sitting by her bed, his head in his hands. You've been watching me, she said softly, her voice weak but warm. Someone had to, he said, startled. You scared me. She smiled faintly. You thought I'd leave too. The words hit him like truth he'd tried to outrun. He didn't deny it. I can't lose another person. He stopped himself, but the silence finished the sentence. Renee reached out her hand, trembling slightly, as she touched his wrist. Dorian, I'm not her. I'm not going anywhere. His jaw tightened. That's what she said? And she meant it, Renee said gently. But this isn't that. You can't keep holding your breath waiting for something to break. He looked at her, and for the first time in years, he let the tears come. I don't know how to stop being scared, he admitted. Then let me help you, she whispered. We'll do it together. The fever broke 2 days later, but something else broke too, the wall he'd built around his heart. When she was strong enough to stand, he made her soup, fussed over her too much, and earned the teasing smile she'd been too weak to give before. You're worse than a nurse, she told him, laughing softly. I'm better, he said. I only have one patient. By the end of the week, she was back at work, but something in her had changed too. She had seen the fear behind his calm, the depth of his love hiding beneath all that restraint. The second test came only a month later. Money had been tight that winter. Between daycare school fees and groceries, things stretched thin. One night Renee came home late, her shoulders sagging, her voice frayed. They needed someone to cover nights, she said, setting down her bag. You're already working too much, Dorian said, crossing his arms. We'll manage. I can't keep taking from you, she said sharply. I need to stand on my own 2 feet. This isn't taking, he said. This is life. We're supposed to share it. You don't understand, she snapped, and then seeing his expression softened immediately. I can't feel like someone's saving me again. I've lived that before. I can't live it now. I'm not saving you, he said, his tone quiet but firm. I'm standing next to you. There's a difference. You're saying that because you don't know what it's like to depend on someone and have them disappear. He stared at her pain flashing across his face. You're wrong, he said. I know exactly what that's like. The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Renee exhaled, shaking her head. I didn't mean I know, he said, interrupting softly. But listen, you don't have to prove anything. You're already enough. You really believe that she asked, her voice cracking. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Something shifted in her, then her anger melting into exhaustion. She sat down at the table, rubbing her temples. I'm just scared, she admitted. Every time something goes right, I wait for it to fall apart. So do I, he said quietly, sitting across from her. But maybe that's how we know it's real, because we're both still choosing it even when it scares us. They sat there for a long while, two people learning that love after loss wasn't about perfect timing, but about courage. That night when they went to bed, Renee curled into him, her hand resting on his chest. It had been over a year since that first kiss in the backyard, and though Dorian and Renee never announced anything, the truth lived in the small moments, in the way she always brewed his coffee just right, in the way he always saved her a seat on the porch, in the way their hands found each other naturally when no one was looking. They had promised to take things slow, and they had kept that promise not because they feared breaking it, but because every step forward felt too precious to rush. Still, some questions lingered quietly in the corners of the home. Questions only a child could ask without hesitation. It was a Saturday morning in early summer when it finally came. The kitchen was filled with sunlight, and the smell of pancakes, the usual Saturday routine. Dorian stood at the stove, flipping the golden rounds, while Micah set the table humming a tune he'd made up. Renee was helping Junia braid her hair, her laughter soft and melodic. Hold still, sweetheart, she said, securing the last tie. Junia looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. Mom, she said, are you and Mr. Dorian gonna get married for real? The question froze the room in an instant. Dorian dropped the spatula, and Micah snorted into his orange juice. Renee blinked color flooding her cheeks. What makes you ask that, honey? She managed her voice careful. Because you love him, Junia said simply. And he loves you. And Micah said we're already like a family. So, when's the wedding? Micah, still grinning, muttered. Told you she'd say it. Dorian looked at Renee, his eyes wide but amused. Well, he said, scratching the back of his neck, that's quite a question before breakfast. Renee shot him a look that said, don't you dare laugh. But then she laughed herself, unable to help it. Maybe one day, she said, gently brushing Junia's cheek. We'll see. But why not now, the little girl persisted. You already kiss. That did it! Micah burst out laughing, and Dorian nearly choked on air. Okay, that's enough out of you, Renee said, red as the strawberries on the counter. Eat your breakfast. The moment passed with laughter, but the question lingered in the air long after the dishes were washed, and the kids ran outside to play. That evening, when the sun began to set and the porch light flicked on, automatically Dorian stood outside watching the kids chase each other through the grass, their laughter floating on the warm wind. Renee joined him with 2 mugs of tea, handing him one without a word. You know, he said quietly, she's not wrong. Renee sipped her tea, staring out at the yard. About what? About us, he said. About being a family. She turned to look at him. We already are, Dorian. Yeah, he said, but maybe it's time to make it official. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning but gentle in delivery. Renee's breath caught slightly. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying, I can't imagine life without you and those kids. I'm saying I've been ready for a while. She set down her mug, hands trembling slightly. Dorian, you don't have to answer, he said, stepping closer. I just need you to know that this us, it's not temporary for me. It never was. She looked up at him, eyes shining in the fading light. You're serious? Dead serious. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a ring he had bought months ago but never found the right moment to give. I've been carrying this around for weeks, he said, waiting for the perfect time, but I realized there isn't one. There's just now. Renee's hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, she whispered. Dorian Renee Latham. He said, his voice low but steady. Will you marry me? For a moment she couldn't speak. Her heart felt too full, her eyes burning with tears that spilled freely down her cheeks. Yes, she whispered finally, her voice breaking. Yes, he smiled. slipping the ring onto her finger. It wasn't grand, it wasn't expensive, but it was everything real, a simple silver band that caught the light and glowed softly in the porch lamp's warmth. Behind them, Micah and Junia had stopped their game watching in wide-eyed silence. "Are you two getting married for real?" Micah asked, his voice loud with excitement. Dorian laughed, nodding. "Looks like it." The two kids screamed with joy, Junia throwing her arms around Renee's legs while Micah shouted, "Finally?" It was chaos and perfection all at once, the kind that only comes from a family that had been forming long before they noticed. That night after the kids had fallen asleep, they sat on the porch again, the same place where everything between them had begun. The air was warm, the stars low and bright above the dark rooftops. Renee leaned into Dorian's shoulder, twisting the ring lightly on her finger. "You really waited a whole year to ask," she murmured. "I wanted to be sure," he said. "Not about you, I knew that from the start, but about myself. I needed to know I could love again without holding back. And now," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple, "I'm all in." She smiled against him, her eyes closing. "You're a good man, Dorian Hale. You make me want to be one." They sat like that for a long time, saying little, listening to the quiet pulse of their home. Through the window he could see Micah's comic books scattered across the floor and Junia's tiny shoes by the couch. All the small signs of a life rebuilt, a life shared. "Do you ever think about that night?" Renee asked suddenly. "The storm." "Every day," he said softly. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd just kept driving." She reached up, touching his cheek. "You didn't," she said. The night the rain came back felt like a circle closing. The wind carried that same metallic scent as it had years before, the sky flashing with streaks of silver that split the dark horizon. Dorian stood by the living room window, watching the storm roll over the rooftops, his reflection merging with the blur of rain. Behind him, laughter and warmth filled the house. The home that once stood silent and hollow now breathed with life. Renee was finishing dishes, humming softly, her wedding band glinting each time her hand caught the light. The kids were sprawled across the living room rug, their comic books and stuffed animals scattered like small reminders of how far they'd all come. It had been nearly 3 years since that first night when a desperate nurse and her baby had been caught under a streetlight, and a tired black father had made a choice that neither of them could have known would change everything. The house felt different now. Not because of the furniture or the paint Renee had added, but because of the laughter that had replaced the silence, the small rituals that had built meaning from the ordinary. Pancakes on Sundays, walks after dinner. The porch light always left on, not out of habit, but as a promise. "Looks like your old friend's back," Renee said from the doorway, smiling faintly. Dorian turned, raising an eyebrow. "Who the rain," she said. "You always get quiet when it comes. Guess it reminds me," he said softly, "of everything. Then maybe it's not such a bad thing." She joined him by the window, wrapping her arm around his waist. They stood together watching the water slide down the glass, the thunder distant but steady. "You ever think about that night?" she asked. "Every time it rains," he said, "I think about how easy it would have been to keep driving, how I almost did." "You didn't," she reminded him, squeezing his hand. "That's the only part that matters." He smiled at her, his voice low. "You know, I used to think saving you was just me doing what anyone decent would do, but now I see it was more than that. That night didn't just save you, it saved me too." She leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice quiet. "You gave me back hope when I had none left, Dorian. You gave Junia a father she never had. And you gave me a reason to live again," he said, brushing his thumb along her hand. "You taught me that love isn't what comes after pain. It's what survives it." From across the room came Junia's small voice. "Daddy, can you read to us before bed?" Dorian smiled at the word, Daddy. It still hit him in the chest every time she said it. "Sure thing, sweetheart," he said, crossing to the couch. Micah and Junia made space for him between them, holding open a worn storybook that had been read too many times to count. Renee curled into the armchair, watching them with soft eyes. Dorian began to read, his deep voice carrying over the hum of the rain. "Once upon a time, there was a knight who thought he was meant to save everyone but himself." He read, Until one night he met a princess who didn't need saving. She just needed someone who'd stop in the storm. Micah grinned. "That sounds like you," he said, earning a laugh from Renee. Dorian continued. They both thought their lives were over, but together they learned that sometimes saving someone else is how you save yourself. When he finished, the kids clapped, delighted, though neither fully understood why their parents looked at each other the way they did in that moment. Renee rose, whispering, "Bedtime, you two." They protested as always, but eventually shuffled down the hallway, their laughter fading behind the door. The house grew quiet again, save for the steady beat of the rain. Dorian turned off the lights, leaving only the soft glow from the porch lamp that spilled through the window. He joined Renee on the couch, pulling her close, her head resting against his chest. "It's strange," he said. "Back then I thought life was over. I couldn't see anything past the pain. And now look at this." She smiled without lifting her head. "You built this?" "No," he said. "We did." The thunder rumbled again, low and distant, like the memory of something long forgiven. "You know what I realized tonight?" he asked. "What that rain used to sound like loneliness to me. Now it just sounds like home." Renee looked up at him, her eyes bright. "That's because you stopped running from it," maybe he said. "Or maybe because you walked into it with me." She laughed softly, leaning up to kiss him. "Either way, we made it." "Yeah," he said, wrapping his arm around her. "We did." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that felt like peace instead of emptiness. Through the window, lightning flashed again, illuminating the porch where it had all begun the night he had opened his truck door and let a stranger step into his life. He thought of how broken they both had been, how certain he'd felt that neither of them would ever feel whole again. And yet here they were, surrounded by the proof that love could rise from ruin, that the smallest act of kindness could ripple into something bigger than either of them could have imagined. "You ever think we were meant to find each other?" Renee asked. Dorian smiled, his voice barely above the whisper of rain. "No," he said. "I think we chose to, and that's what makes it beautiful." She nodded her fingers, tracing circles against his chest. "You think it'll always be this way?" "No," he said honestly. "There'll be storms. There always are. But now I know I don't have to face them alone." Outside, the rain softened, tapering to a gentle drizzle. The world seemed washed clean, the streets shimmering under the glow of the streetlights. Dorian rose, walking to the porch door, and stepped outside for a moment, letting the cool droplets touch his skin. Renee followed, slipping her hand into his. They stood beneath the overhang, watching the rain fall softly onto the garden Renee had planted the summer before. "It's funny," she said, "how the same storm that once almost broke me led me here. Sometimes that's how grace works," he said. "It finds you in the wreckage." She turned to look at him, her smile soft. "Then I'm glad you stopped that night." "Me too," he said, because that was the moment everything started to make sense. The clouds began to part, revealing a sliver of moonlight. The world glistened under it, alive, renewed. Dorian looked out at the rain-soaked street, the porch light casting a halo across the wet ground, and thought about all the people who might be out there tonight, tired, afraid, lost, just like he had been. "If someone else is standing in the rain right now," he said quietly, "I hope someone stops for them too." Renee smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "They will," she whispered. "Because you did." He kissed her forehead and drew her closer. The storm eased to silence, leaving behind only the sound of dripping leaves and the quiet heartbeat of a home that had once been empty, but now overflowed. Dorian thought of how everything they had endured, grief, fear, hope, love, had come together to make something stronger than either of them alone. They had saved each other not through grand gestures, but through patience, through showing up when it mattered, through choosing to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. And as the first stars broke through the clearing clouds, Dorian whispered what he knew to be true. Sometimes, he said, the second chance isn't a place you find, it's a person. Renee smiled, her fingers tightening around his. And sometimes, she said, that person shows up in the rain, the end. If this story moved you, make sure to like and subscribe for more true-hearted stories about second chances and love found in unexpected places. Tell us in the comments what part of Dorian and Renee's journey hit you the hardest, and where in the world are you watching from?